Okay, well, it is noontime, so we will get this started. Thank you, everybody, for joining in today for Coffee with Kathy. As you can see, I am definitely not Kathy. She is unable to be with us, at least for the beginning. Maybe by the end, she might pop in, we're hoping. But we have some great information for everyone today. So I am going to turn this over to Bridget, who is going to facilitate this today. And we'll see you in about an hour, Bridget.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for that lovely Kathy-like introduction, Tara. I'm Brigid Rankowski. I use mixed pronouns. I'm an artist, educator, and advocate who lives in Portland, Maine. I participate on state and national disability boards, as well as working with several different research groups to address intersectional topics such as healthcare barriers and suicide prevention. I'm also the founder of The Way We Move, a social circus program promoting the circus arts for marginalized communities. When I'm not doing advocacy work, I'm a professional fire-breathing mermaid and the reigning Miss Mermaid Maine and Merfolk Maine. So with that, I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists today. We have Cynthia Grimm, she, her, is an author, fiber artist, and advocate in Maine. She is an advocate and activist for disability and neurodiversity rights and an educator who translates neurodiverse communication to neurotypical communication and back. She is the founder of Autistic of Late, a social media blog about late identification of neurodiversity. She is an autistic, disabled, ADHD, homeschooling, solitary parent to her wonderful autistic child, medical alert service dog, and a pride of cats, and a grandmother to a dwarf hamster. We also have Andrew Komorow. Him is passionate about neurodiverse financial planning and employment, working with employers to customize employee benefits and employee wellness programs to hire, recruit, and retain neurodiverse talent. Andrew is a certified financial planner and founder of Planning Across the Spectrum. He is a Connecticut House of Representatives Autism Spectrum Disorders Advisory Council appointee and frequently speaks on his own experiences or on various financial and insurance planning topics. He is also the founder of the Neurodiversity Index, measures of performance of the top 79 U.S. listed companies that are leaders and advocates of the neurodiversity movement to support individuals with autism and other cognitive or neurological conditions. The fact that there are 79 companies is significant, as 79 is the periodic table of elements number for gold, or AU. Ha ha ha. As a business owner, husband, and father, Andrew does not get much spare time, but when he does, he enjoys tinkering with electronics, travel, and bike rides. He resides in the Farmington Valley with his wife, two daughters, Lucy and Emma. We also have joining us today Lisa Morgan, founder and co-chair of the Autism and Suicide Committee of AAS, American Association of Suicidology. She is a certified autism specialist, self advocate, consultant, researcher, and author. She is a consultant for the HFA Autism and Grief Project and the $9 million Picori Research Award to teach. Lisa serves on the board of directors for the Autism Society of Maine. And for those of you who tuned in last week, gave an amazing presentation on suicidology and autism, and that Coffee with Kathy will be hosted on our website pretty soon. So I'd like to thank you all for joining me. It's a real pleasure to be talking about the subject, late in life diagnosis. It's something that is garnering a lot more attention, and for good reason. Not everyone has the ability or resources to be diagnosed as a child, and we're here to talk about some of the challenges, successes, and experiences of all of you. So we're going to start out with the question, before being diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, did you receive educational supports, accommodations, or a different diagnosis in childhood? And Lisa, I'd like to ask you if you have anything to say on this.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Bridget. My answer is no, none at all. I was in school from the late 60s through the 70s, graduated high school in 81. It wasn't on anyone's radar. I was a quiet student, did okay with the schoolwork, and kind of fell through the cracks. Nobody was really interested in the kid who was alone on the playground, ate lunch alone, things like that. So no, I didn't get any supports.
Cynthia, do you have anything to chime in?
So when I was young, that was when, autism was still thought to be, just bad parenting. So there really were no supports back then. I had some teachers who recognized that I was a little different and worked extra hard to help me feel more comfortable in school. But otherwise, there was no support, and same as Lisa, I was that very quiet, meticulous student. I worked very, very hard on my schoolwork and tried to, be invisible as much as possible. So, there just wouldn't have been any supports available to me back then. Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that is a situation that sounds like is a familiar one to so many. Andrew, what about your experiences?
So one of the things that's interesting about my late diagnosis is the fact that I was the stereotype in every way, shape, or form. There's no, which bothers me a lot actually. But there's no way it should have been missed. Late to speak. The mail, just all of it. It was still missed. I was diagnosed with just about everything but autism later. Because once I started, speaking, well, at 4, okay, maybe, he'll be fine. So as far as different diagnoses go, again, pretty much all of them. So.
Yeah, I'm very similar to Andrew's situation where I got the alphabet soup of diagnostic labels. Um, and I received speech therapy from a young age, and that was kind of the foot in. And because I suffer from Ehlers-Danlos connective tissue disorder, I was unable to write like a lot of my peers, and this is back in the 90s where there weren't computers readily accessible. So that kind of streamlined me into specialized services because I still to this day have the handwriting capability of about a middle schooler, and that's on a good day. Um, so let's go on to question number 2. Was there a time where you knew you were different from your peers before receiving a diagnosis? And Lisa, I'd like to hand this back to you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I was diagnosed about 10 years ago at 48. So years and years and years of knowing I was different than my peers. But I do remember the day it became very clear. Kindergarten, I would say, is the best year out of all the schooling years I had. Kindergarten was my best year. First grade, it was sometime after first grade started, and a girl, I know her name's Jill, and a couple of other girls came, kind of circled me on the playground and kept asking, why do you do this? And I can't remember the exact questions, but why do you do that? And why is this? And I was like, yeah, I was questioning it myself, but didn't tell, it was just kind of a situation where they were going around and taunting me. And I was like, that's the day. I also became the person who was, bullied in the hallways, sat alone at lunch. If the teacher left the room, it's kind of scary sometimes. And just that's the day it started for me, where it was pretty cemented that I was different. But yeah, years and years and years of not knowing why.
Yeah. I'm sorry that you had to experience all that, Lisa. Um, Cynthia, what about you? Was there a time where you knew before your diagnosis?
Yeah, it was also related to kindergarten. When I did my kindergarten screening, they said that I was, academically, I was more than ready. I could have gone to first grade. But socially, they were like, no, she's not going to be able to do this because I couldn't speak to any of the evaluators. I didn't speak the whole time that I was there. If they gave me a worksheet, I did that. But and I could point to colors and all of that stuff, but I couldn't actually talk. So what they did was pretty innovative. I had a lot of kids in our neighborhood who were either a year older or a year younger. There were no other kids that I knew who were actually my grade. So they sent me to kindergarten one day the year before I was supposed to start. And I sat at a table with two girls from my neighborhood who I know well, and just kind of to see how I would handle being in that situation. And I came home gushing. I loved it so much. We had music that day, and I learned a new song, and I hung out with my two friends, and that was so great. And then I got to kindergarten in the fall, and there were just things that other kids just seemed to know that I didn't. For instance, the first day, it's okay, everybody line up for recess. And I was like, line up? Like, I don't know what line up means. And you'd think that I would, because I come from a big family. So we did have to get in a line. But the words line up just didn't make sense to me. It was like get in a line would have made sense. And so I just kind of like watched what the other kids were doing and then said, oh, okay, I'm supposed to do that. And then everybody in the line is talking about, will you be my partner? Will you be my partner? And I was like, are we in a Western now? Like, what is this? Yeah, howdy partner? I don't get it. And so a girl said, will you be my partner? And I said, okay, sure. Having no idea what this was. We got out to the playground, and she basically, she kept grabbing me by the arm and spinning me around and throwing me across the playground. I was covered in bruises because I had no idea how to communicate to her, I don't like what you're doing. And there were just so many situations like that. For instance, the first time that the teacher said, okay, everybody put your heads down on your desks. I literally put my forehead on the desk. I didn't know you were supposed to put your arms out and let rest your head on your arms. Like, this made no sense to me. And the teacher actually came over and like kind of, tapped my arm and showed me like, oh, okay. It's like, this is such a weird thing. Like, why would you put your head on your desk? That's so crazy. So there were just so many little things that just kind of added up. And I was like, I am not like these other kids. And when I did start talking to a couple of classmates, nobody else came to kindergarten early the year before. And I was like, oh, I was just special. They liked me so much, they wanted me to come early. And it was many years later that I said, oh, that was because they didn't think I was ready for kindergarten. So that was kind of, the eye-opening. And then a couple of years later, they wanted to skip me second grade academically, but then said, no, she won't do well socially, which actually would have been better for me because I would have been moved up to classes where I actually knew more classmates and would have been more comfortable because I'd been playing with those kids since I was, 2. So, but yeah, it was just a whole lot of little things just built up. And I was like, I have no idea what is going on here. And I have no idea who these people are because they're not acting like people I understand.
Thank you for sharing. Andrew, what about you?
So I a little bit of a different, approach. I don't think I knew, like, blissfully ignorant, I think, is a lot of it. Like for example, until after my diagnosis, I didn't think I had anxiety, because if you've never not known anxiety, there's no baseline, right? And also very similarly, I remember a conversation distinctly with my wife. I was reading Diana Lipsky's book, right? Anxiety Meltdown, right? And I'm like, I don't have like a routine or like a schedule, right? I think she would like slap me across like the face. Like, what the F are, she's like, you're like the most like, routine schedule oriented person. I just never thought I was, right? Or another example is, I have aphantasia. I can't visualize anything in my mind at all. Horrified as a kid if like I needed to do a police sketch. These are the things I worried about. But again, so like if I just thought, everyone was like that, then you didn't, know you were different, if that makes sense.
No, it does. When our baselines are so different, like our normal is possibly not what other people view as normal. I know, being the daughter of an artist, a lot of my creative endeavors are not normal by normal standards, as I breathe fire and do free diving and dress up like a mermaid. But uh, I was very thankful to have a really supportive mother who had these conversations with me from a young age that kids just learn differently. Uh, I left class every Tuesday morning, so that I could go and do speech therapy. There's times where even before we had the label of autism, there was something different about me. Back in the 90s, it was just too sensitive or highly emotional. These types of digs that were given to like raised female people, where it's like there's nothing wrong with being emotional. There is sometimes a problem when we don't know what to do with our emotions or how to communicate it effectively, but that's not on us. It's not something inherently wrong with us. Um, Thankfully, the world's getting to be a little bit more knowledgeable about the diversity out there, which is a wonderful thing. Um, Moving on to the next question, I'll be very interested to hear all of your responses. Were there any barriers to you receiving a diagnosis? And what were they? Lisa, handing it back to you.
Well, thankfully, no. I was very fortunate to, the first person that I went to try to see what was going on had a son on the spectrum. So she was very familiar with autism. Still not really the way it, presented in women, but still, we talked for a few sessions. I had gone to a psychologist and, a couple of tests and just background information. And then I got the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome at the time. And so it was a pretty easy thing for me, thankfully.
That's good to hear. Cynthia, what about your um, journey to diagnosis?
The diagnosis itself was pretty barrier free. I had a job at the time that provided health insurance that covered the evaluation completely. And I had paid time off so that I could go and get it done. So that all made it easy financially. My main barriers were the stigma attached, and also really kind of, I talked to several friends who also are self-diagnosed autistics now. And we were kind of saying, well, like, is there any value in actually getting this diagnosis done? Because like, if I know that I'm autistic, then what's the point of having somebody else say, hey, you're autistic? So it was really kind of wrapping my head around the reasons why I would want to do this more than being able to access the evaluation itself.
Thank you. Andrew, what about you?
So I think the hardest barriers to entry would be that there was such a long history of many, many years of me going to lots of different places, not at home, and being diagnosed with so many different things, and never having a baseline, right? And for somebody to look at my history without, judging all the history, right? Just to take that kind of objective approach when I'm in a good place. I think that was one of the more challenging things is, generally if somebody's not already in therapy, that they don't start from a good place, right? So I think, and then sticking with it long enough to, have a good baseline and for somebody to kind of, see and look past some of, the other diagnoses that somebody else has made, almost not sharing that, and all the history and what you may or may not have been diagnosed with, I think would have been a lot better, because then there just were, preconceived assumptions. The professional will assume that the other professional had an accurate diagnosis. So, and yeah.
Yeah, I know from my own experience, I was diagnosed when I was a teenager, so definitely not into adulthood, but a barrier that I faced was the practitioner that I was seeing for therapeutic reasons, refused to give me a diagnosis because he said, and I quote, he had never met a woman with autism, and I would not be the first one that he diagnosed. Yes, lovely man. Also, why I don't trust minds. Um, but I had also a very strong history of trauma and physical disabilities. So being able to, after a while, sort through the different pieces, is this sensory processing disorder? Is this complex PTSD? Being able to sort through that and identify the root autism that existed there was very much a barrier for me and my mother trying to get a diagnosis. And we didn't have like the funds, and also living in the state of Maine, there aren't a lot of practitioners who feel comfortable diagnosing adults. And I am non-binary, but that's a relatively new realization. There's still a lot of, as Andrew was talking about, bias for diagnosis. And how does autism look like for women? How does autism look like for men? There used to be the old school conversations of the masculine brain and stuff like that, where it's really just a hunk of meat. It does not come in pink or blue colors. That's not how that science is. But yeah, I'm grateful that we all have had not as traumatic situations or barriers as I know a lot of other uh, community members have. Um, so. This ties into our next question. Uh, Thinking back to after getting a diagnosis, how did your family, friends, or loved ones react to your diagnosis? Lisa, would you like to say something about this?
Sure. So after I got my diagnosis, I didn't kind of run out and tell everybody because I was unsure of how people would react, and no one believed me when I did choose a couple people here and there to tell. Um, as far as my family, they would remember, Lisa was just really clumsy. Lisa kept to herself. She read a lot. Yeah, she didn't really have a lot of friends because she was so quiet. And, so there's things in my childhood that go along with being autistic, but they still don't look at like I was always anxious, about everything. And, that just doesn't kind of connect really. I would visit, we had two elderly people in my neighborhood, and I would visit them. That's who I would go and talk to. It's those two ladies. But it just, yeah, it just doesn't kind of connect for them. And I've had other people in the family since then, children being diagnosed with autism, but it's still, for some reason, doesn't connect with them for me. So.
Thank you. Cynthia, what about you?
I pretty much did the same. I didn't just start, saying, "Hey, look, I got diagnosed." It was kind of a long process. I think part of it was I needed to kind of process all of this new information myself first, and really understand what my differences are and the coping skills that I have learned, which to that point may not have been the healthiest coping skills, and trying to find new coping skills. With my friends who already knew, we'd already had these discussions. Should we be diagnosed? Should we not? I didn't feel comfortable telling them because none of them had the resources to actually be evaluated themselves. And so I kind of felt like, oh, here I am holding this over them. Look, I got diagnosed and you can't, even though it would completely not have been like that. And they would absolutely not have felt in any way bad about this. But that was my self-talk at the time. With my family, really, I only told my sister. I have 5 siblings, but my sister who lives here in Maine is the closest. And then kind of inadvertently told my mother because she happened to be present the day that my daughter was being evaluated the first time when she was 2. And they asked, is anyone else in the family autistic? And I said, well, I am. And here are the other relatives who are diagnosed. And we have a lot of folks who are, who have autistic traits who have not been diagnosed. At jobs, I was absolutely terrified to reveal that I'm autistic, partly because I spent most of my career working in middle management and in human resources management. And I saw all of the ways that these companies were deliberately discriminating against people who had various disabilities. One experience that I had, we had an employee who had said that she has OCD and anxiety. And, I had talked to her about, some accommodations that we could make because it was affecting her job performance. And I went to my boss and the HR director and sat down for a meeting and said, she says that she has OCD and anxiety, and here are the issues that she's having. And here's an idea of, things that I think we can do. And my boss interrupted and said, well, have you seen an actual diagnosis? And I said, I don't need to for disability accommodations. And I looked at, and I quoted ADA, and I looked at the HR director, and she just sat there. And I said, ADA says that if you identify as having a disability, you get supports and you get accommodation, regardless of whether you have a diagnosis from someone else. And she had no idea that was the case. She was like, no, we have to get documentation before we do anything. And it was like, I'm not telling anybody at work about this because they're going to discriminate against me too. And I spent so many years fighting for accommodations for people with disabilities and, being blocked in so many ways that it was like, I'm not telling anybody. So my current job, I work a part-time job now that I am fully disabled. And it's the first place that I have ever said, yes, I am an autistic person, because it's a very supportive nonprofit organization where I feel like I can actually be my whole self and advocate for others as well. So that's been really amazing for me to be able to just be out, just tell the world. I added the AU tag after my name on Facebook, hey, everybody, I'm autistic and I'm cool with it, and you better be too. So that's been really cool. But for the first couple of years, like I told no one. And then it was like slowly adding like a little bit at a time, before, completely just like throwing the doors wide open. You're muted, Bridget.
Thank you. And you're such a good mother and role model to your daughter. So, like, yay for being able to shout that out with that. Um, Andrew, what about you? How did family, friends, loved ones feel afterwards?
It was surprising all around, not for what I expected. I mean, my mother's mind was just like blown. She felt bad about missing it. I mean, in all fairness, it was she 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 went to have an assessment without me there because my father didn't believe in it. So as you can imagine, that was basically impossible to do. So where there was a book, the Spirited Child, basically saying I was, but exactly. So my mother's just like amazed that she missed it. Like I said, all the stereotypes, I got them. And then my father had actually ended up ending our relationship, which was probably a good thing for other reasons. I found, as far as friends went, the friends surprised me. I think, and I think Cynthia, I don't know if she alluded to it versus kind of, or I related to it, and that was the friends who were maybe involved with autism a little bit or thought they were, like, that was actually the harder ones to come out to. It was the friends who, like, I remember I was at 2 a.m. in my friend's basement. He's one of the first people I told, doing things that I don't do anymore that young people shouldn't be doing at 2 a.m. in a basement at a friend's house. And he mentioned that if when he had kids, if they had some disorder or something, like he'd have abortion. I can't remember how this came up. We're just talking statistic. I'm like, but I'm autistic. He's like, cool. And then we did some more stuff we shouldn't have done at 2 a.m. And just so very accepting. That was many years ago, everyone. But no, so that really surprised me. Just some of the people who I thought would be the most judgy were kind of like the most accepting. And then some of the people where maybe they had experience with autism or like an autistic kid or something, and I like those were the relationships that almost got torn a lot of different ways. It was interesting. Same goes for employment. I mean, for the most part, depending how you're mentioning it, it's, oh, okay, that's cool, right? And not really, too much either way. There's been a few, let's call it negatives, but I mean, for the most part, work was like, oh, that makes sense. I told my former manager, who's grateful that I don't work for him anymore. And he's like, oh, that makes sense. And money is your special interest. Got it. Like, it was very surprising, actually. In summary, to close it, the people I was closest to, who I thought would be the most supportive, were actually quite the opposite. It was very much the other way around, as far as, just kind of accepting it. Maybe it's because they feel bad that they missed it or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I received my diagnosis after my brother received his. Um, and my mother, I mean, she likes to tell me of how back in the 90s, other kids' parents were like, oh, Bridget lines up her blocks in order. Like, why can't my kid do that cool thing? Because we didn't understand the like autistic characteristics back then. Um, but it hasn't really changed a lot of my relationships with people. I think in part because I was always kind of friends with like the theater oddballs. And now I'm friends with a bunch of fire spinners and mermaids and like circus performers. So like a lot of neurodiversity going on there. But I also echo the statements of difficulty with employment. That's been really challenging in the past too, where how do you disclose what accommodations you need? How do you sometimes know what accommodations you need if you're trying to put your best foot forward in a job situation and you don't want them to pass you on to the next person. Um, so if anyone here is in the live Zoom webinar, we may have some time at the end to have some Q&As. You provide the Qs, we'll provide the As. And with that, let's go on to a question that I feel like we'll have a nice tone, hopefully. Did things in your life become easier, more difficult, or stayed the same after receiving your diagnosis? Lisa, anything you would like to share about this?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to say all of the above. Um, it became easier because I finally knew why I never fit in. I finally knew why I always felt different. I could breathe and know that, it wasn't just me as a person, it was, there was something, I had a name I could call it. More difficult because, eventually after processing the whole diagnosis and working through it, I look back and what if all the what ifs came in? What if I had known earlier? What if my life could have been different? What if all those what ifs made it a little bit difficult for a time? And then the same, because, none of the difficulties and challenges I had went away. So I was still kind of struggling to fit in. I was still, just all the different challenges that come with autism. They didn't change. They had a reason, but they were still the same.
Thank you for sharing. Cynthia, anything you would like to add?
I think for me, it wasn't so much that things got easier or more difficult. It was just things were different. One of the biggest things that started to change after that diagnosis was my self-talk. I have always struggled with selective mutism, which is currently a separate diagnosis, but I personally believe that it is an autistic trait. I could talk fine if I was with people I was comfortable with, my family, close friends, but anybody else. And it was like, I'd try to talk and I'd struggle and I'd get so mad at myself because I couldn't talk. And I'd end up in tears. And it was just like, why do I do this? Like, why can't I just talk like other people? And there were so many situations where it was like, I know I need to do the thing. I know I need to do the thing. I know how to do the thing. Why can't I do the thing? I just do the thing. Why are you so dumb? Like, why can't you just do the thing? And I would get so angry with myself for my differences, not understanding that it was a difference, not a shortcoming. And so, I would really, verbally beat myself up for things that, I now understand were, executive function issues. And, I have the understanding of why I wasn't able to do those things, or why it was so difficult for me to do those things that seemed like they were easy for other people. So, I still struggle with that. Even this morning saying like, what am I doing? How am I even qualified to be part of this panel? It's still a struggle, but at least I have that knowledge that I can say, this is part of my neurotype, and this is why I'm feeling unable to do this. And, I can change that language from I can't do this to I feel like I'm unable to do this right now. And this is why here are things that I can do to make it possible for me to do this. And having that knowledge, it has made things better, but it was really a lot of, inner work to figure out, oh, I'm really not nice to myself. And I need to change that. But it's also, being the parent of an autistic person now, that has changed so much for me, because, that self-talk has had to change, because I'm saying to my daughter, this is a strength. This is something that's really wonderful about you. And this is why this thing that you're trying to do is challenging, and let's work through that. So preparing her, I started when she was a few months old. I started, doing, like, we did exercises in the mirror, because one of the things that I've always struggled with is the nonverbal language, facial expressions and body language and all of that. I never had any clue what people were actually saying with those things. So we would spend time in front of the mirror, and I'd say, I have happy face, and I have angry face, and I have stern eyes. And, we would do all of this stuff. And then, when she was a toddler, she would go up to people and say, I have stern eyes. And we would all laugh. And, and she was able to understand these things at a much younger age, because I went through that inner work and was like, oh, so it's been really enlightening to kind of recognize, like, oh, I did the same thing when I was a kid, and, helping her navigate those challenges now rather than when she's in her 30s. So that's been really helpful.
Thank you. Andrew, what about you?
So I would say not in the beginning, or the very beginning. My wife has a degree in psychology, so there was the part where I thought she did this on purpose and she hid it from me to hurt me, which is not true. Bridget's laughing because she also knows my wife. That's why she can't control herself right now. But also there were just some things that were helpful. So a great example is, I don't know if I call it selective mutism. I just don't finish my sentences. I finish them in my head. I just stop saying them out loud. Well, my wife had started finishing them for me, and without the diagnosis, wouldn't have come to the conclusion that we had arguments that we never actually had, because I thought I said something, and then she thought I said something. So we each both walked away thinking we had complete arguments or conversations when we didn't. So having that was helpful. And I can't remember again how mentioned, but talking more about, I wanted to reach out to people who were like me, and what I discovered is I have much more in common with somebody who loves computers and who loves finance than I do with somebody who simply shares a diagnosis, right? So I kind of gravitated towards that, and then a little bit back, and that not everyone's going to be my friend because they're autistic, and that, again, it's just such a whole spectrum. So I think, the other just big thing is just knowing myself, knowing my limits. I think masking is, it's important. We kind of all have to do it sometimes, but allowing, myself time to recover, recognizing that it, is hard, not pushing myself insanely hard, which, Bridget, yes, I push myself less now. I think that would, be, kind of the main thing. The other easier thing I'll just say is bright lights. Like, I thought everyone was just bothered by the lights and they just sucked it up, right? Like almost like giving myself permission to, have the lights off all the time, and just it's not affecting everyone, but knowing that, like, it's okay, it makes me feel better. So that's what I'm going to do, and just doing some small things for myself.
Oh, thank you for sharing. I also feel like I know a little bit more about you and your wife's relationship now. It makes so much sense. Um, I know for me, receiving a diagnosis helped other diagnosis. So, for example, like uh, when I had a loss, like my first big loss of my grandfather who helped raise me, Grief isn't a subject that makes the most sense sometimes, being autistic. The same with some of the supports for PTSD. There's been information on how eating disorder resources don't carry over to the autistic community as well. So, because I am someone who has multiple, both neurological as well as physical disabilities, being able to uh, take the lens of autism as a way of, okay, how can I improve my EDS? Like, um, when I used to be in martial arts as a kid, like everyone was like, "Oh, tighten your core and stuff," and but then they'd also be like, "Tighten this or strengthen that," and I'm like, at once, like I didn't understand that the average person can do all of that stuff like normally because I very closely resemble one of those toys where you press the bottom and like it goes completely limp. Um, so by getting my autism diagnosis, um, I feel like things have gotten a lot better for me. And my hair is blonde-ish now. When I look like this, I know I also have a lot of passing privilege. So I can hide myself as opposed to when I'm rocking the purple blue hair that makes me stand out. So by learning to embrace, for me, my authenticity and talking about what makes me unique, my strengths, my challenges, it's had a positive impact on my life. Um, and before we move on to some of your amazing questions that are popping up in the chat, like to end our scheduled questions with, if you could give a piece of advice to someone who is questioning if obtaining a diagnosis is appropriate to them, what advice would you offer? And Lisa, I'd like to have you start us off with this.
Thanks. I think the best piece of advice I could give is to just be very, very, very selective about who you go to. And, a lot of professionals can tick off the box that they are, autism friendly, or they know about autism, when they really don't know what it's like to live with autism. They may know the medical model of it, but they don't know what it's like to live with it. And so having a diagnosis be wrong because you went to a wrong person would end up being worse than having no diagnosis at all, I think.
Cynthia, what about you?
Yeah, everything Lisa said. I've had 2 evaluations. The first one was excellent. It was a neuropsychologist who really has a good understanding of autism. The second one agreed with the autism diagnosis, but got everything else in that evaluation wrong. Because she was using tools that are actually invalidated for autistic people because we don't have the same thought processes that neurotypical people have. So some of those psychological tests are going to say, oh, well, if you say this, then it means that. But for an autistic person, it actually doesn't. We don't think the same way. So not understanding that those tests were actually invalidated by the fact that she agreed that I'm autistic, really kind of made that whole report completely useless. And, I think one of the biggest things, if you present as female, you really have to be selective with who you go to, because a lot of practitioners do not understand that it does look different. For instance, a young autistic friend, she had been through several evaluations and not been given the diagnosis, and she went for another one when she was about 20. And while she was in the waiting room, she approached another woman and said, "Oh, your necklace is beautiful. That's really striking." And she went through the entire evaluation, and then the practitioner said, well, you can't be autistic because you walked up to a stranger and complimented her on her necklace. Now, for this person, jewelry and stones in particular are a special interest. So, she is going to automatically be drawn to this really cool necklace with a big stone. So it was completely wrong. She has since gotten the diagnosis from someone who does understand a little better. But, a lot of people think that they are autism savvy when they really are not. They know what autism looks like in children because that's what they learned in school. They don't necessarily know what that looks like in adults. And so that's one part of it for me also, because I also have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. When I went to the geneticist for me and my daughter to get the official diagnosis of EDS, a lot of those questions were about autism diagnosis, which we both have, and whether, family members were diagnosed as autistic or have autistic traits. That's part of it because EDS is so closely linked to autism. And there are a lot of coexisting disorders that are linked. And if you know that, okay, I am autistic, it's easier to get those other things diagnosed, which may, relate to a medical issue that needs to be treated. So I think it's important if it is accessible to you. But I also recognize that at the time that I had my evaluations, I had the privilege of having those evaluations. Not everyone is able to do that. It's expensive. And if you don't have insurance that covers it, it's not really accessible. So I just want to say that self-diagnosis is completely valid. If you can't get that evaluation, get books, get on social media and follow the pages of people who are autistic advocates and, listen to what they say and say, oh, hey, I relate to that. That's me. Some of the stuff is like, oh, I relate to that. And like, you find out that all the neurotypical people relate to that too. But there's a lot of things that we all kind of say, oh yeah, that's totally a neurodiverse thing. So kind of spend time with those people and find the autistic tribe out there and hang out with them and say, oh, I really fit here. And that will answer a lot of those questions for you.
Thank you. Andrew, any pieces of advice?
So, I think the question, should be what is the reason, why you're looking to obtain a diagnosis. And I think if it is accessible to you, I think it's a good thing to do. There is a chance, people self-diagnose, incorrectly. I don't think that's, the most common, but having, an accurate assessment so you can be your best self, I will say is always, the most important and, the best way to do that. Just because you don't get a diagnosis doesn't mean, that you're not. There's tons of valid reasons for self-diagnosis, but I would say, for suspecting it and then having it, right? And even, being diagnosed, but then I think I had my third autism assessment because I may lose autism supposedly when I go do a clinical trial. And I don't even know why I was nervous that they would say I wasn't autistic anymore, right? For some reason, with my third ADOS a year ago. And it's very validating in a way that's hard to describe that I don't think I could have predicted. So I would say if you have the opportunity to do so, I would encourage it. There's clinical trials that will test people because that's how I've got a couple of mine, and that's no charge. If you are able to get in one as a suggestion, I do give lots of people. And if you can't, the advice from Cynthia was fantastic. And that's also what I'd recommend. And again, just be, kind to yourself and treat it as, again, you're doing it to learn. Go into it with learning more about yourself.
Thank you. Thank all of you so much for being a part of this amazing panel. We do have a couple questions. Might not be able to get to all of them, but I definitely want to try to hit some of the ones. If you could choose one or two things, what has helped you navigate life the most? Networking with others, a support group, therapeutic relationship or talk therapy, learning self-advocacy skills, or possibly advocating for others.
I think for me, learning self-advocacy skills and advocating for others, and they're very closely tied, because in order to advocate so strongly for my own daughter, I had to learn how to advocate for myself as well.
Thank you. Lisa, do you have one or two tools that have helped you the most?
Yes, I think joining some of the online communities have helped, and also advocating for others has been very, very helpful for me too.
What about you, Andrew?
Can you repeat the question again?
What has helped you navigate life the most? Networking with others, a support group, therapeutic relationship, learning self-advocacy skills, or advocating for others?
I'm going to go with none of the above. I think what has helped me the most
Of course you are.
is learning to take a break and take some time to myself and making sure that I get quiet time so that when I can work on those things, I can work on them to the best that I can.
Thank you. And of course you choose other, Andrew.
But you're
We have a
disappointed
question.
it was a good answer and other. I know you're a little disappointed. So
We have some questions about resources, books to share with people's parents who are in their 80s who may not understand kind of what autism looks like. Does anyone have any books that they highly recommend? I know my personal one, in part because I'm part of it, Sincerely Your Autistic Child by the Autism Women and Non-Binary Network. Amazing book, highly recommend it. Andrew?
So my favorite book, I think Amazon says I've ordered like 50 copies, is From Anxiety to Meltdown by Deborah Lipsky, who I think actually is in Maine somewhere, hiding in somewhere, or just, but anyway, best book on autism. Get past the cover where she's holding a raccoon. I promise it's worth it. That's my advice.
Lisa, do you have a book you might
For me, it
recommend?
was Pretending to Be Normal, by Leanne Wiley.
Leanne Holloway Wiley.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And also for other people to understand, I think Uniquely Human by Barry Prasant is good too.
Such a sweetheart, both of them. Cynthia, do you have a book that you recommend?
I don't have anything for other people to understand autism, but one of my favorite books that I read, which was recommended by a neurodiverse colleague, was Songs of the Gorilla Nation.
Sandra Hughes.
Thank you. I couldn't remember her name, but that was really, really helpful. She covers her journey through autism and late diagnosis, and that really, I connected with that so much, partly probably because she is a zoologist, and that's kind of a special interest of mine and my daughter's. So she kind of makes connections with animal language, which I understand way better than human language. And so it really, that there were so many parallels, and I really love the way that she expresses how she got to her understanding and diagnosis and all of that.
So good. Love that book. Of course, I know. I'm like, Sandra Hughes. So we have a few more questions, but we're out of time. So for the panelists, thank you so much for being here. And if people have more questions, where can they find you on the interwebs? Cynthia, where can people find you?
I recently started a Facebook page called Autistic of Late, where I talk about being diagnosed late, specific autism traits that may kind of fly under the radar and that sort of thing. I don't post as often as I like because of my physical disabilities. I have a neuromuscular disorder that is why I'm running out of breath right now. But it makes it hard for me to type a lot now. So that's kind of the best place to find me.
Lisa, where can people find more information about you?
My website, autismcrisissupport.com.
Thank you. And Andrew, where can people find you?
Everywhere on the internet. So generally my Facebook page, Planning Across the Spectrum, or the same thing, which is or on LinkedIn under Andrew Komorow. I'm the only one other than a Russian hacker who might also be me. You just don't know that. And I do post quite frequently on LinkedIn, usually, and Facebook. Actually, every day. I have not missed one day in almost 2 years. So
I'm not giving you an award for that.
I almost did once. It was like 11:55, and the anxiety of like missing that day, like I have a 5-month-old, haven't missed a day. So the day it happens will be sad.
And
I post memes, and I do a podcast with Brigid.
yeah, thanks.
Yes.
Thanks, Andrew.
It is the most not boring podcast, well, ever, but especially about money. I know a lot about money, and Bridget knows a lot about everything else. And that is the podcast, and we try to, break it down. So
Two Autistics Talk Money. You can find us wherever you find podcasts.
And 2autisticstalkmoney.com.
Really?
Yeah, I buy all the domains, right?
Okay.
So
Well,
yeah,
apparently there's a website.
yeah, exactly. So
thank you so much. And Tara, are you coming back on to say what's up next?
I am. Thank you so much, everybody. And to answer, I think there were a couple questions in there. We do have a lending library here at the office, and the books can be found online if anybody is looking for resources. Just give us a call or email, and we can send some to you. Next week, we have another panelist. Yes, Bridget will be joining Dr. Carrie Magro for Coffee with Kathy next week, which should be a great segment as well. I just want to thank you guys so much for being here today. This was a lot of fun listening to you, and being able to hear your experiences and some of the things that you've dealt with has been wonderful, and I think can help a lot of people. So this is going to be it's recorded, so it will be posted on the website. And if anybody missed any of the connections on where to get anyone, we can get those, and we will post them as well so people can find you all. So once again, I want to thank you.